Good morning, everyone. Glad you're all still hanging in on day three. Just one lecture to suffer through today, so I'll try to keep it relatively painless. I've been joking with the other instructors. I had this very long list of all the things I wanted to add to my talk and all the things I wanted to cover, and each talk kind of covered more and more of them, and I kept, just as I added things, I checked them off. So I'm actually back to the talk that I kind of planned from the beginning, more or less. So it's going to be slightly different from some of the others. This is more of a research presentation of current work rather than kind of a broader thematic lecture, although I will try to pull some of those threads together at the beginning and the end to kind of situate the work. I do want to highlight my collaborators. The work I'm presenting is a big project. It's not all my work. So Nicole, Raphael, Jordi, Kwame, Mahilet, and Bamadeli have all played important roles in this, and you'll see some of their names again later, but not all. So I wanted to make sure that they all were recognized. Most of the work I'm presenting is a project funded by the US Department of Energy through the Critical Minerals Innovation Hub. Critical Materials, sorry, Innovation Hub. Uh-oh. Which button advances? Okay. So I think you're all aware this kind of global phenomenon in many places of mining being quite controversial, having a lot of conflicts, resistance, right? A kind of legacy that's somewhat troubled both in environmental and economic aspects in a lot of places. We've already seen this chart twice. I thought, why not go for three? We know that mining has this reputation problem that is global. We could show this breakdown by countries, and it's quite similar in most places. That then kind of maps onto communities around the world. So this is the Global Environmental Justice Atlas. I've filtered it to only show mining conflicts. So if I had unfiltered it, there would be all these other colors of dots. The orange are just the mining conflicts. And you see, this is a global dynamic of people feeling like there are environmental injustices surrounding these mining projects. From an industry perspective, this same problem is very well known and very recognized, right? Companies lose millions from delays that social conflicts and lack of social acceptance in some places cause, right? So this is a very important problem, no matter kind of which angle you're coming at it from. And I think that for me, what I take from this kind of setup is the idea that it's important to be looking for these mutually beneficial pathways and how we can have a different story around this industry, which is, as we've had pointed out, ultimately necessary on some level. So from this background, then I'm going to move into my main focus, which is this kind of moment, this critical minerals moment or critical minerals rush. I will apologize a little bit because I know it's a quite global audience, but I'm going to talk about the US. So that's my caveat. I apologize. The critical minerals moment kind of really began in earnest. There were some precursors, but the Biden administration really made this big push for critical minerals. You see the president sitting in front of an EV that's broken down into its components. It really has been seen as this opportunity to somehow change the mining industry's image or its role in society, right? This opportunity to no longer be this villain in the kind of crude term or the crude characterization, right? One of the things that's been really interesting in all of the other breaks and discontinuities between political administrations in the US, the critical minerals has remained quite consistent, right? There has been this continuity from Biden to Trump around this critical minerals agenda with some tweaks, right? Instead of talking about a green critical minerals agenda, it's more of a dominance and security critical minerals, but the policies are actually not that different. And the investments keep flowing, right? These are big investments. It's not just a narrative. It's a billions of dollars of taxpayer money, of government incentives. It's really an embrace of industrial policy, not in a hush-hush whisper, but very upfront and in the open industrial policy in a way we haven't seen in a lot of American industry in a few decades, right? So this is a really big thing. But each of these headlines, and I could have put, I could have done that thing where they just keep populating, right? There could be hundreds. Each of these headlines is a new project in a new site in a new community that has these potential impacts. And so that's what I want to kind of get to focusing on. Skip all the material I cut out. So what I'm going to do in this talk is look at the impact of critical mineral narratives. So I've pulled just a sampling here from the projects that we're actually looking at, or what kinds of claims and narratives are companies making around critical minerals. You could find similar claims and narratives being put forward by government agencies and policymakers and others. And the idea is that these narratives are rhetorically positioning critical minerals as having a higher level of importance or being inherently more acceptable than mining in general. And that is intended to make their development more favorable or more viable. So we've kind of conceptualized this as the idea of like, perhaps there's this critical minerals consensus where, sorry, I've lost my place, where it's appealing to multiple interests and multiple stakeholders that don't necessarily always see eye to eye. So you have a security interest group that's focused on military, national security, and that they see these interests in critical minerals. You have this economic focus group that's really interested in economic development, national development, secure supply chains that can facilitate that, and they see these interests in critical minerals. And then you have this last environmental group where the links to energy transition, the idea of critical minerals as energy transition minerals, then brings them into this coalition. And you see critical minerals as being this kind of the center of this Venn diagram. I will note for those of you who, coming from more social science background, you might be familiar with Thea Rio-Francos has talked about a very similar term. She talked about the security sustainability nexus, right? This idea of kind of a strange bedfellows moment of these converging interests that don't typically converge around the idea of critical minerals. So our research question then is, how do these critical mineral discourses influence perceptions of and reactions to mining proposals? And do critical mineral projects then have more public support or social acceptance than so-called ordinary minerals? So again, our framing a little bit, the urgency around critical minerals is so taken for granted in policy and industry circles. I feel like the number of conferences I've been at where it's just taken for granted, the urgency here, what we want to understand is whether it has that public resonance, right? That public resonance of these ideas is somewhat less clear than the urgency in the industry and policy spaces. And so that's what we're really trying to dig into here. So what I'm presenting is the results of a kind of a 3-year project. It is a multi-site project looking around the US. Our selection criteria was focusing on nickel and cobalt, both of which are battery metals, and looking at new projects that are proposed that are not yet operating. You'll see one of our secondary sites is actually an operating mine. I guess 2 of our secondary sites are operating mines, but our 3 primary sites in Idaho, Missouri, and Minnesota are all proposed mines that don't yet exist. And we were purposeful in picking some that have been relatively welcomed and some that have been quite controversial or have had a lot of opposition to try to understand both of those dynamics. One of the things, I know a lot of you won't be familiar necessarily with what these places are like or what they mean, but all of these sites have in common that they all actually have a long history of mining. So all of these are areas where mining is a generational activity, although some of them have had breaks in that activity. They're not always continuous, but they all have a long history of mining. So none of these are absolutely brand new, even if the project itself may be greenfield. Just to give a little flavor again for people who might not be familiar, this is the Missouri site. In Missouri, this is an area that is a historic lead mining district, so making batteries, just a different kind of batteries. The mines in this area have been running since the colonial era 1700s. But in this town, Fredericktown, the last mine closed in 1966. So you have a full generation with no mining. The whole county, actually a 5-county area, is a Superfund site, which is an environmental cleanup designation. So there's massive lead contamination. What you see here is by and large the kind of semi-reclaimed lead mining after effects. You can see it from this aerial photo, right? The reclamation area, the old tailings, and then where the new processing plant would be kind of in relation to the historic smelter site. And this indeed is the case in a lot, not just in the US, I think, but that a lot of these new critical mineral projects are indeed returning to areas with long legacies of mining, whether they're current mining sites or not. And so you have this layered dynamic of understanding a new project in light of the legacy of old projects and how that history and culture interacts with these other dimensions of how people engage with these projects. So I'm going to go through 3 kind of methodological pieces of our research project. Again, this is a big team project. It's not all my work, but as a group. And it kind of is going to go from a large scale and drill down. So the first thing I'll talk about is state level surveys. So this is representative populations within each of those states. I guess I can't point, but at the state level of Missouri, Minnesota, and Idaho. Then we'll drill down to do local surveys in the actual communities where the projects are proposed. And then I'll drill down further to look at a particular interest group and their perspectives. So the first one, I'm not going to talk much about this. This is the work of Kwame and his team at Missouri University of Science and Technology. This is a very quantitative approach. They surveyed 1,800 people across these 3 states. They did a statistically significant representative sample of these communities, and they did a discrete choice experiment. So this is a common method in economics. And what it asks people to do is to weigh trade-offs and to make decisions about trade-offs between employment, tax revenue, and environmental impacts for these hypothetical mining projects they've been presented with. And importantly, the only kind of thing I'm going to highlight from this work is the people were split into 2 framings. Half were told that the mine would be a precious metals mine, would produce gold and silver. And half were told that the mine would produce lithium or cobalt that would be used in batteries for electric vehicles. And what we found in that study, or what they found in that study, is that those framing that framing had no statistically significant impact, right? The kinds of choices people were making about these trade-offs, those preferences were not altered by thinking that it was a lithium and cobalt energy transition metals mine versus thinking it was a precious metals mine. Now, that was these broad state level samples. A lot of the participants inevitably lived in urban centers far from the mine, maybe didn't have that kind of local perspective. So the next thing that we did, we wanted to try to make sure we reached these kind of hard to reach and hard to survey, especially rural communities, kind of low engagement community members who nonetheless have really important perspectives to share. And so what we did in 2 of the sites, and we'll do the 3rd one coming up in August, is we went to a local fair or festival. In Idaho, we went to a rodeo. In Missouri, we went to a carnival. And we set up a booth for 3 days. And we offered people a gift card if they would take our survey. And again, our goal with this really was to hear from your kind of average community member in these sites. Now, in the end, we collected 360 surveys. The results I'm showing you today are just from the 255 who actually lived in the county. So some of the other people were visitors at the fair, but they lived farther away. And just for today's results, I've excluded those people. As a starting point, both of these communities in Idaho and in Missouri are quite welcoming and supportive. These are rural, kind of traditional communities. You can see kind of right where the numbers are in the gray bar, that's the center line. So you can see in both cases, more than 60% of people were supportive. And this is asking the general opinion of the mining industry, right? So we have this kind of broadly supportive context in these 2 places. And so what we wanted to do was drill down within that to understand what are the drivers of that support and how does that relate to the idea of critical minerals. So this is one of the questions. And again, I'm not going to get into everything we did. But this is one of the questions that we use to try to drill down in that. And can you all read the labels or not really? Excellent. So we asked people for each of these factors to what extent does it influence your opinion about mining in this area? And the options were whether it makes me more likely to oppose a project, it's neutral or has no change, or it makes me more likely to support a project. And what I want to highlight here is that the ordering of responses is nearly identical in the two sites. The choice with the highest support that makes people more likely to support the project is if the project strengthens the local economy. And then that's followed by strengthening the national economy and decreasing dependence on foreign imports. So these are all ultimately economic factors. The decreasing imports one does have a critical minerals angle, right? But these are three economic factors, and they all three rank at the top in both places. The factors that are more clearly and directly aligned with this critical minerals idea about what they'll be used for fell down to the bottom of the ranking. Neither one was negative by any means. I don't want to give the wrong impression, but they were lower in that ranking. So if the output would be used for military or national security applications, and if the output would be used for green technology like electric vehicles, what we saw was that these were more likely to be neutral or had a lower level of positivity. Again, these were positive factors, but we found that they were less compelling. That what people were really motivated by first and foremost was that economic consideration, more so than these kind of critical mineral justifications. And then finally, I'm going to kind of spend the most time here. The last thing that we did, so we drilled down from our state level to our local level, and then we wanted to really pick into that interest group. If you remember from the Venn diagram, right, we have critical minerals as this coalition between economic and security and environmental interests. And we really want to say, is that happening, especially for the environmental group? And the reason that I focus on the environmental group is because they're the ones in that imagined critical minerals consensus or coalition who are expected to take a position farthest from their normal position, right? Environmental groups that typically are critical of or skeptical of mining projects, are they instead supporting these specific projects for cobalt and nickel because of the energy transition or critical minerals link, right? And so this work that I'm presenting here, this is qualitative interview-based research. We conducted 71 interviews with a whole range of stakeholders in these three states. And broadly what we found is that these actors, these kind of broad coalition of different types of environmental actors are not taking this critical minerals narrative at face value and indeed are kind of contesting both the definition and the operationalization of the idea of critical minerals. So they're asking questions like, are these minerals really needed for energy transition, right? That's the link that we have to the concept. Would they have a significant impact? Are the projects and their claims realistic? This is a big one in the minds of people. And are local economic impacts, local environmental impacts justified by what those benefits would be? And those are questions that people were presenting as challenges to both the projects and the ways that they were connected to critical minerals. So I want to kind of take I think a little detour helps here to talk about cobalt in particular and see the way that those questions are asked in these projects. So two of the projects are primary cobalt projects, and the third set of projects in Minnesota are actually copper nickel projects, but they would produce more cobalt than the primary cobalt projects as byproduct. Cobalt is classic, has so many of the characteristics we've heard about all week of critical minerals. We have highly concentrated production in Congo. We have highly concentrated processing in China. So you have this geopolitical or geoeconomic angle that's there that's like at the heart of a lot of this critical mineral activity. You also have a highly volatile market, which has all these challenges on a kind of business side. And you have these really wildly varying projections, right? So this actually is a graph from Jordan Calderon, one of the grad students in our group, published this paper. And it really shows like, what do we think is going to happen with battery technology? And will we need so much more cobalt than we have now, or will we actually not, right? And so there's all of this uncertainty that I think is quite characteristic of a lot of these kind of low volume, especially critical minerals. And so For the people that we interviewed, right, for these classic critics of mining, their perspective is that the whole reason cobalt and nickel are considered critical minerals, and this is, I mean, they're correct in this. The reason cobalt and nickel are considered critical minerals is because they're used in battery technology, right? But opponents were quite vocal in these interviews in saying battery chemistries are changing. They would talk to me about LFP versus NMC, right? They would talk about, well, is sodium battery going to come online or iron air battery is going to be possible, right? They would highlight that LFP batteries that don't use any cobalt or nickel are already the dominant factor in Chinese EVs. This is the green bars, the two green bars at the far side. Chinese market that is the leading EV market in the world is dominated by non-cobalt batteries. In the US and EU, that's not the case yet, but it could be in the future. And so they would point out in these interviews that with these shifting battery chemistries, and in relationship with the long timeline for mine development, would this nickel or cobalt that was produced ever make its way into an EV? Would these even be battery minerals by the time these mines could produce? And so using logics like this is just one example of the kinds of conversations we were having, but using logics like this, these organizations and their leaders rejected the idea that accepting these mines and the trade-offs and sacrifices that they implied for the local environment would be justified by the contribution to green technology or energy transitions. Instead, you would hear quotes like this, insisting on looking for alternatives, ways to reduce demand, considering recycling and other alternative sources. These are the things that I heard quite frequently, the idea of supposed critical minerals, right? So not just asking about whether those mines are the right mines, but even taking, even kind of poking at the concept itself. And so what we found is that this criticality concept was not disrupting these traditional dynamics of opposition to mining. And this last point is kind of key here. I've lost my notes, so I'll just go from the screen. This last point is kind of key here, that if indeed we can imagine this consensus between security and economic and environmental interests all converging on critical minerals, the environmentalists we talked to were quite clear in pointing out that they feel like the junior partners in that model, right? That perhaps their interests are served by critical minerals, but that they feel that they're clearly subordinated to the economic and security interests that are also served by critical minerals. And so that was a really important point that they would bring to the forefront. So this is, again, another quote from one of the interviews. Critical minerals policy is just a shortcut to mines. There's no concessions in it for environmentalists. What would the policy concessions be that would actually make this work for everyone? And I will note quickly that all these interviews, or the vast majority of these interviews, were conducted under the Biden administration. So this isn't a story of the shift to a more militaristic critical minerals under Trump. This is mostly a Biden era dynamic. I will note, since we've been here this week, I just had a paper accepted that's basically this like method 3 work that I've been talking about. So within the next week or two, you can look for that and read in much more detail this kind of qualitative work that I presented there at the end. So kind of stepping back and pulling in these 3 methods and these 3 different ways of engaging this problem, what we argue is that these critical mineral narratives have a positive valence, but a somewhat limited resonance, right? So they're across the people we talked to, some of whom were quite supportive, some of whom were truly neutral and legitimately couldn't care less, and some of whom were quite vehemently opposing these mines. Across those groups, it really, for the most part, did not, the critical minerals conversation was not front and center of what they talked about. It was economics, it was environment, it was a lot of these classic things. And so this is kind of our takeaway. And again, this was work that was funded by the Department of Energy. And the first time I gave this presentation, it was to a Department of Energy audience. And so our takeaway is this: social acceptance for critical minerals mining is driven by the same dynamics, with the same opportunities, but also the same challenges as mining in general. And that's kind of our big takeaway. instead of thinking about how do we use this critical minerals framing to justify mines, we should be thinking about how do we build mines that are acceptable without needing a critical minerals framing to justify them. One note that I'll kind of touch on, I think there can often be a tendency to take a different takeaway, which is we need better communication and more education and outreach. And I guess I don't disagree with that, but I do think it's important to push back a little bit. I think if we think about that method 3, the qualitative interview work, those opponents, those critics of these projects were not ignorant. They were highly educated on these projects. They had educated themselves. Now, we can talk about whether all of the arguments they made were in good faith, whether they were taking a kind of spaghetti against the wall approach. There's critiques to be made, but they were highly educated, and this was not a critique rooted fundamentally in ignorance. And so I think that while there is a kind of perhaps a knee-jerk reaction to revert to saying, well, we just need to educate our way out of this problem, I think that for a lot of cases, that's really just not the lesson that we think should be taken here, and that more of the lesson should be that we need to think about critical mineral mines in the same way we think about mines that don't have that label in the front. And that's a more fruitful solution across the spectrum of mining projects. So again, just a final quote to wrap up. I mentioned at the beginning this idea that the urgency around critical minerals is so taken for granted in a lot of these policy and industry circles, and that what we found in this research is that public resonance really is less clear and less obvious, and has a limited influence with the public. So this is this is an elected official saying the number of times I've heard from constituents, well, where will we get the nickel for our Teslas is 0, right? This is an inside the dome kind of argument. And so again, that resonance in these broader publics is somewhat less. I will highlight this is a new paper that just came out. I have nothing to do with it, but it's quite similar in its conclusions. They did a media analysis here in Europe around lithium projects. And what they argued is that the critical minerals narrative is hegemonic in the media, but that it has quite little influence on local communities in how they engage with projects in their place, right? So it's a very similar kind of finding from a European study. So just a few final reflections. I think I'm still good on time, so I'll indulge myself. I'm trying to tie this back together with some of the bigger themes around critical minerals and the things that we've talked about this week. So Aparajita in her talk asked this question whether just transition is perhaps becoming an empty signifier. And I think that there's a similar question to be asked, right? Is the critical minerals concept, does it remain meaningful? And this is meant to be somewhat of a provocative question, right? I'm not fully just throwing out the bathwater or the baby. But I think it's an interesting question to ask. And so I think there are 2 points that I would make here. One, right, the new US critical minerals list, 60 critical minerals. For those of you keeping score at home, that's a full half of the periodic table. So I think there is this moment of if everything is critical, perhaps nothing is. And I think the cynics in the environmental community would argue that this just reinforces their skepticism all along that the critical minerals idea was just a justification for any and all mining projects at the end of the day, right? So I think that there's something to be said about making too broad of a tent, and what that does for kind of watering down the meaning of a concept. The other one, and this is something that Irene pointed out in her talk, right? The energy transition link of critical minerals, I think, is on a daily basis becoming weaker and more tenuous, right? More and more of these critical minerals, and I think the Trump administration has made this really obvious, but I think it has carry-throughs from all along. And it is not just an American concept, that more and more of these these critical minerals are going into military or security or other uses that have nothing to do with energy transitions. It's ironic, I think, on some level, because there was an earlier era of critical minerals around the world wars and the Cold War, and there was a very strong industrial policy justifying critical and strategic minerals. a lot of the same things we're doing now we did then. And so it's really kind of a return to form, right? That critical minerals is more about security as actually kind of the classic understanding of the term. So then for me, as someone who I guess, my interest in critical minerals is in that environmental sphere more so than anything else. So what would it take, or what would it mean to kind of reclaim that term? And again, here I have 2 points to make. One, I was at a geography conference. So it's quite a critical social science audience. And there was a whole day, actually more than a whole day of sessions on critical minerals and mining and communities, work similar to this. I presented this work there. And one of the arguments I kept hearing was really needing to abandon the term of energy transition minerals or energy transition metals, because those metals are not going into energy transition uses by and large. And we've kind of seen that idea. But the argument that was being made there in kind of a somewhat political or critical way was that we should strategically stop using that term. And I would actually say the exact opposite. Because in my view, I think by insisting on the term energy transition metals, perhaps we should stop saying critical minerals. And if we say energy transition metals, then the fact that that nickel doesn't go into an EV, or that cobalt goes into an alloy for a fighter jet instead of a battery, right, then becomes something that we can push back against and leverage. If the term we're talking about is energy transition metals, then they should be used in energy transition uses. So I think that there's an interesting conversation there to be had about, I understand the critique of saying we don't want to call these ETMs because that's not how they're used today, but I do think there's a pressure point there to say if we call them ETMs, we can insist on those uses. So not giving in to the greenwashing, calling it out and pushing back against it. The other thing I think, and this is just like really trying to highlight some of the work of others that I appreciate, I think there's an increasing push, and we've heard this throughout the week too, of understanding that we need to reorient, that the idea of critical minerals has been too north-centric, has been too narrow, has been not energy transition focused enough, but that it could be reoriented around those things. So I really like this piece from Daniel Franks and his collaborators about how we could reorient critical minerals around human needs. And it takes a quite global perspective on human needs too, which I think is an important corrective of a lot of the work we've seen. So just kind of a last point here, highlighting some work that I was able to participate in with some colleagues of trying to think through as we reshuffle the deck of where extraction happens, and as we expand these extractive frontiers into both new and old places, what would a just distribution of critical mineral production look like? And so we highlight these 3 concepts that we think should be central. Whether people and places sustaining production can thrive, whether critical mineral production and use is aligned to human needs, and the extent to which production actually mitigates climate change. And so again, I guess my takeaway is like, rather than solely pointing out the gaps between an energy transition notion of critical minerals and the reality, that there are ways to try to push to reorient what these concepts mean back to other meanings. This is I was just going to mention this. This is like completely unrelated, but I think it is a nice like final note. So I guess I'll say this is from Thomas Piketty and his group, and they basically sat down and did the math and said like, does the math check out to have a globally just transition in terms of ecological limits, in terms of economic and environmental requirements? And they basically argue that it does, that there is a like actually possible globally just transition to be had, that the math does work out. It's a really great report. It just came out in June, I think. So check it out. And that's it. Thank you.